And thank you for signing up for this session. I look forward to sharing a little bit of my experiences in voting rights and how that shapes my understanding of the current racial crisis. I got involved in voting rights cases for the first time in 1980, when the Supreme Court handed down a decision that was regarded as disastrous by supporters of minority voting rights in a case involving the city of Mobile, where I lived and was teaching as a history professor at the University of South Alabama. In those days, voting rights cases were decided by the courts under the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court decided that in a constitutional challenge, it was necessary for minority plaintiffs to prove that the election practice they were challenging was adopted or maintained with a racially discriminatory intent. It wasn't sufficient to show that it had a discriminatory effect on minority voters, preventing them from electing candidates of their choice or placing barriers in the path of registration and voting. One had to show that the law was intended to do that. In the particular case of Mobile, the at-large election system for the city commission was adopted in 1911, and the at-large election for the county school board was adopted in 1876. There weren't any fact witnesses to put on the stand who had been involved in those decisions, and it fell to historians to figure out what was going on. To me, it seemed a passing strange thing to do. If we were concerned about how a voting practice affected minority citizens in the 1980s, why should we focus on the 1870s or the first decade of the 20th century? But that was the standard the Supreme Court said minority plaintiffs had to meet. And so I had two research assistants, graduate students at the university who helped with the research. And after a long effort, we figured out the basic story and presented it in court in 1981. 2 weeks before the first case in which I testified in Mobile, 2 weeks before the first case in which I testified, a young black man named Michael Donald was lynched and hung from a tree branch 2 blocks from the Presbyterian Church that Patricia and I attended. The same investigator who had cracked the case of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963, a guy named Bob Eddy, found out that this deed was carried out by 2 young Klansmen in Mobile County. And they were sentenced to life terms in the penitentiary. And after that, the Southern Poverty Law Center brought a civil lawsuit and drove that Klan organization out of business. So it was still a time when there was a bit of danger involved in race relations in Mobile and in the rest of Alabama. How, you might wonder, was a poor white boy from Southside Virginia getting involved in cases like this? The answer is that it was the work of 2 different institutions. The University of Virginia, where I was an undergraduate in the early 1960s, and the Presbyterian Church that Patricia and I attended in Charlottesville, beginning in the fall of 1963. We had been raised in more or less evangelical Methodist churches in the South, where social justice was a concept that was never entertained in church. And so it was fortuitous that the nearest church to our apartment was a Presbyterian church. And at Westminster Presbyterian in Charlottesville, the minister, George Telford, introduced us to the theology of Paul Tillich and Karl Barth and Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and also introduced us to the concept of racial justice. The associate pastor was a young minister named Robert Albritton, who had grown up in Andalusia, Alabama, not too far southeast of Montgomery. And he introduced us to a book called Race and the Renewal of the Church by a Southern Baptist preacher named Will Campbell, who was an advocate of racial justice. Bob later, in the spring of 1965, went down with the blessings of the church and marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama after the attack on civil rights marchers by Alabama state troopers and the local sheriff's deputies in Selma, Alabama. It was quite a surprise to find someone from a white boy from Alabama who was marching in that march from Selma to Montgomery, but there you have it. I had become interested in the history of race in the South through reading the work of historian C. Van Woodward.
Oh, yeah.
He became my model as an historian because of his writings about the relationship of race and politics in the South, and because he was himself involved in dealing with the racial crisis in his own time. He and a number of other historians, including the great African-American historian John Hope Franklin, had helped Thurgood Marshall and his team in addressing the issues in Brown versus Board of Education, the case that ended racial segregation, or at least began the ending of racial segregation in the schools of the South. Woodward had written an essay that focused my attention particularly on dealing with the racial crisis of 1963, an essay called Equality, the Deferred Commitment. He said that in the Reconstruction period, the 14th and 15th Amendments committed the United States to civil and political equality for African Americans. And it had been deferred for almost 100 years by capitulation to the disfranchisement and segregation laws adopted by the southern states and localities. It was time, he said, to meet that commitment. If those views sound familiar, it's because they were echoed in Martin Luther King's speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at the March on Washington in 1963. Dr. King said that in the 14th and 15th Amendments, the nation had given a promissory note to the Negro people of the United States. And when they presented that note, they were met with the explanation that that there were insufficient funds to meet the nation's obligations. And it was time to meet those obligations. When I decided to become an historian, as you can see, the idea was that historians are involved in public policy matters in the present. And so I began my career with the hope that I would not only write about the relationship between race and politics in the South, but that I would find a way of contributing to dealing with the current crises and figuring out how to move the South in a different direction. And when I was asked to become involved in voting rights cases, that's what I decided to do. After the plaintiffs had won the Mobile cases, I was asked to provide written testimony to the House Judiciary Subcommittee that was considering amending the Voting Rights Act. And I did so, explaining, as I was asked to do, how time-consuming and expensive the research had been, and how silly it was to put an historian on the stand to talk about things that happened 100 years ago in deciding whether the election system used in the 1980s was fair. At the time, the Congress thoroughly agreed with that point of view, and they did amend the Voting Rights Act to create a statutory route around the constitutional barrier that the Supreme Court had set up in the case City of Mobile versus Bolden in 1980, making it possible under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which had never been used for this purpose in the past, to outlaw election practices of all kinds that were discriminatory in their effect without proving that they were intentionally adopted to accomplish that discriminatory end. When I looked at the hearings volumes in which my testimony was included, I found testimony by George Telford, my first Presbyterian minister, who was then working for the National Council of Churches. Later, he moved on to become a theology professor at Columbia Seminary in DeKalb County, Georgia. So there I had the Presbyterian Church providing cover for my back. It was comforting to know that the church agreed with the necessity of promoting democracy for minority citizens, and that it was stepping up to the plate to advance that cause. Over the years, we learned through voting rights litigation a number of things about the relationship between race and politics that I think are important to understanding where we are now. And my hope is to share with you some of those key insights this morning, leaving plenty of time for Q&A after I stop talking. The first thing I want to emphasize is that in every single voting rights case that minority plaintiffs have won, and I'm talking here about African Americans, about Hispanics, and about American Indians, because I've worked on cases on behalf of all of those minority groups. The first thing is that plaintiffs always manage to prove that voting patterns are polarized along racial lines. That is to say that the majority of whites vote against the candidates preferred by minority voters, and the majority of minority voters vote for a candidate they would like to see elected, and that this racially polarized voting usually results in the defeat of minority preferred candidates. That is as true today in 2021 as it was in 1981 or 91, or for that matter, 1965. It is quite astonishing for all of the talk about how much change we have seen in our lifetime, that voting patterns are still polarized along racial lines to the same degree they were when I got into this game in the first place. But that's a fact. Another thing that we've learned over the last 4 decades is that that white voters shifted out of the Democratic Party, particularly in the South, and migrated to the Republican Party, which by the turn of the 21st century made the Republican Party the majority party in most all of the southern states, and in a good many of states outside the South as well. And what that meant is that the Republican Party, especially in the South, was essentially the party of white folks. There were, of course, some whites like us, like our friends, who remained Democratic in their preferences. But the majority of the supporters of the Democratic Party in the Deep South, it turned out, were African Americans. And that meant that the choice of party was affected by race. Now, fortunately, the plaintiffs in these cases don't have to prove, and indeed couldn't prove, that the voters who are voting against minority preferred candidates are racially prejudiced or racially motivated in their choice. For one thing, the First Amendment guarantees the right of people to be racist in their voter choices. It's just a fact of life. Secondly, it doesn't really matter why white people vote against minority preferred candidates. The important thing that courts believe is that they do so, and that the election practice that's being challenged has a discriminatory effect because of that polarized voting. That's the key set of facts. Now we have the Republican Party looking a lot different in the 21st century from the way it looked in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and even to some degree in the 1990s. When the Voting Rights Act was adopted in 1965, it could not have been adopted without strong support from many Republicans in the Congress. When it was amended and strengthened in 1970 and 75 and 82, that continued to be the case. The Republican Party supported the expansion of minority voting rights. And even as late as 2006, when the Congress reauthorized the pre-clearance requirements set out in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years, it was adopted by a Republican majority House and Senate and supported by many of the Republicans in those bodies. It wasn't, in other words, a polarized issue as late as 2006. But now, over the last 15 years, things have changed in a fundamental way. I used, in most of my writing, I had all about the Voting Rights Act. I had emphasized that the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act did not depend on, was not affected by which party controlled the executive branch of government, and therefore the Department of Justice. That under Republican administrations, as under Democratic administrations, the Justice Department was doing its job, and that was true until around 2004, 2005, under George W. Bush's administration, when the Civil Rights Division fell under the control of right-wing Republicans who hired based on party from the Republican Trial Lawyers Association, and essentially shut down much of the work that the Civil Rights Division had done on behalf of minority voters and in other areas of civil rights as well. At the same time, the state of Georgia pioneered in a new approach to voting, the adoption of a photo identification requirement for in-person voting as a way of suppressing African-American vote in Georgia. It was initially struck down as unconstitutional by a trial court judge whose brother was the Speaker of the House in Georgia. He characterized this new photo identification requirement as akin to a poll tax because of the cost of meeting it by minority voters who were poor. The state revised that photo identification requirement to make it less onerous in its effects, and it eventually passed muster in the courts. And I'm ashamed to say that the voting section where I worked decided to pre-clear that photo identification requirement in an arbitrary action by the section chief at the time. Other states adopted photo identification requirements for voting and other discriminatory devices that were challenged in court by private plaintiffs and by the Department of Justice. One of the most important of those cases that I worked on was a case in Texas attacking the photo identification adopted in 2011 by the Texas legislature after years of opposition by Hispanic and African American legislators in the legislature. That law created a photo identification requirement for in-person voting that was so restrictive that over 500,000 registered voters in the state of Texas could not meet that photo identification requirement. Our analysis showed. Again, it was expert witnesses brought in to analyze the very large databases, the voter registration database and the driver's license database in the state of Texas to prove that in court. And they also found that there was a racial disparity in the possession of the necessary photo identification requirements. And that led the trial court to find that the law was adopted with a discriminatory effect. And it also found that it was adopted with the purpose, the intent of discriminating against minority voters. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, arguably the most conservative appeals court in the country, affirmed that finding, that the photo identification requirement had a racially discriminatory effect, although they sent the case back to the lower court to reassess the question of discriminatory intent, which is always pretty hard to prove, and was in that case as well. North Carolina is another case where a state where the legislature adopted a photo identification requirement that was restrictive as the Texas law. But it added other features, and these are other examples of efforts by Republican legislatures to suppress minority voting. They cut in half the early voting period in North Carolina. They eliminated same-day registration and voting during the early period, and they eliminated the provision allowing voters to vote outside of the precinct in which they resided. For example, voting at a polling place near where they worked so they could vote on their lunch hour or after getting off work. Those were provisions that had been put into law when the legislature was controlled by the Democrats. And they had allowed minority voters in North Carolina, mostly African Americans, to register and vote at something approaching the level of whites, which had rarely been the case in the South. And so as soon as the preclearance requirements, which required federal approval either by the Justice Department or by the federal courts, before a voting change could be adopted by a state like North Carolina, which was covered by Section 5, as soon as the Supreme Court struck down that preclearance requirement in 2013 in a case known as Shelby County versus Holder, North Carolina then adopted this very restrictive voting rights law, which of course was immediately challenged in court by minority plaintiffs and by the Department of Justice. And the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals made a finding in that case that the law was not only racially discriminatory in effect, but also in intent. That, as the court put it, that the legislature had searched with surgical precision for the best ways of limiting minority voter turnout so as to control the outcome of elections on behalf of the white voters of North Carolina. And that decision stood. Moving on to our current crisis, we see the same pattern in all of the laws that have either been adopted or are in progress in legislatures controlled by the Republican Party, from Georgia to Arizona and in between. Let's focus on the law adopted in Georgia in 2021, which continued to have restrictions in the use of photo identification required for voting, which cut some degree of early voting, although they did make changes once the protests began to surface in the business community that ultimately led to the boycott of Georgia by Major League Baseball, and the legislature softened the bill a little bit. But the most disturbing thing about this Georgia law, and it's in a lot of other laws adopted in or in progress in 2021, was the way in which it took control of the election administration out of the hands of the Secretary of State and out of the hands of local election boards in Georgia counties if the legislature chose to act. this new law gave the legislature the choice of replacing local registration boards, local election boards who administered elections with its own appointees. And it took the Secretary of State in Georgia, who had always had primary responsibility for supervising the administration of elections, out of the hands of the conservative Republican Brad Raffensperger, who had succeeded Brian Kemp, now the governor of Georgia, as Secretary of State. Why would they do that? Well, as you know from press coverage, Secretary Raffensperger had overseen the administration of the presidential election and the senatorial elections in Georgia in a fair and secure manner. And he had refused then President Donald Trump's request that he find enough votes to switch the election from favoring the election of Democratic candidate Joe Biden in favor of Mr. Trump. And Raffensperger had been denounced by his fellow Republicans for standing up to the president. And so now they simply took control of the administration of elections out of the Secretary of State's hands altogether and gave themselves the authority to appoint people in future elections to administer elections in Georgia. That is going the last mile, going beyond the repressive legislation adopted between 2005 and 2020 in order to suppress minority voters, to something dangerous for the very democratic administration of elections in this country. And if that were to stand, our democracy would be in even greater trouble than it already is. Well, what I have learned is that race infects our political system in the 21st century to a degree greater than anything I have seen in my lifetime since the Jim Crow era in which I grew up. And I find that deeply disturbing. And the Presbyterian Church is, I think, thoroughly committed to seeing this country work through the current racial crisis and return to a system that is just and fair to everyone. I heard a few weeks ago a speech by now Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, who is also the minister of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, and the church of his father before him, Martin Luther King Sr. Reverend Warnock, in this speech, quoted Dr. King's famous aphorism that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And now Senator Warnock said, it's our job to bend that arc. That reflects the view of all of the lawyers and expert witnesses who've been involved in voting rights cases over the last 4 decades. They are all trying to bend that arc toward justice. And that, I think, is the challenge for us as Presbyterians in an age when even evangelical Christians are going against the teachings of the Bible and supporting vote suppression, forgetting Micah's famous passage in which he asked, what does the Lord require of us? But to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peyton. That's very moving. It's by your putting so concisely this decades of history. It's the path we're going on just is it's a little depressing right now. So anybody, will open it up to questions, and make sure you take yourself off of mute if you have questions for Peyton. I'm sure we could probably keep you here all day, Peyton.
Okay, this is Larry, and I have so many questions. So I just want to start. Is there any, in your mind, is there any defensible rule that would require a photo ID? I mean, is there any circumstance that would justify it? To require a photo ID when you vote, whether in person or absentee, which is now what Georgia has required,
Right.
an absentee ballot.
Well, obviously, Larry, we have to prove who we are, but we've always done that by having a registration process that makes it a felony to cast an illegal vote. And we have always carried voter registration cards with us to the polls when voting in person or when voting absentee. But that never required that we produce photo identifications. Moreover, almost all of these voter photo ID laws that were adopted in the 21st century required particular photo identification. For example, in Texas and Georgia, student IDs at public colleges and universities didn't count. That the photo IDs of government employees in local government and state government and federal government didn't count. In Texas, on the other hand, one of the photo IDs you could use when you go to vote was a license to carry a firearm, which required a photo identification and provided one. If you have to get one of those photo IDs that's required, in most cases you needed to have a birth certificate. And in working on these cases, we learned that in most states, something around 10% of the registered voters didn't have birth certificates. People who were born in rural areas, people who were born in inner cities, often were not born in hospitals, they were born at home. And when the birth took place in home, ordinarily the midwife never managed to get a birth certificate from the local government. And so lots of people didn't have them, or they had lost their birth certificate when they moved from one state to another. And it cost you money to get that birth certificate replacement. And you had to go through some bureaucratic hurdles if you'd moved to another state that not everybody could meet. And so the justification offered for requiring these photo identifications was the need to deter voter fraud. And as we learned, as we demonstrated in case after case, excuse me, I lost my chain of thought looking at the chat. In case after case, we demonstrated that there was no history of voter fraud in-person voting. The only places where we found some evidence of voter fraud was in the absentee ballot process, which was in those days primarily used by white people and not by minority voters. And curiously enough, these photo identification requirements in those earlier laws were not applied to absentee voting. They only became required for absentee voting in the current round of legislation, as you mentioned, Larry, in the Georgia law. And why would that be true, would you think? It's because of the massive increase in mail-in voting, absentee voting, by minority voters and other democratically inclined voters in the last few years. And in some states, of course, all of the voting is mail-in voting. And there's no evidence of a massive increase in voter fraud in absentee voting either, even with the large increase in mail-in voting. So the courts in case after case made findings that the claim that photo identifications were required to deter voter fraud were simply pretextual. They were pretexts for accomplishing a discriminatory effect. Does that answer that question?
Well, it does, but my follow-up question is, then why do I still have to present a photo ID instead of my voter registration card when I vote here in Alexandria?
Because the state of Virginia hasn't changed that law that was adopted by the Republican legislature. Hadn't gotten around to it. You can ask Mark Sickles that question on April 18th, because Mark, who is a member of our church, is also a member of the Virginia General Assembly. That's a good question for Mark.
Okay, excellent.
So just following up on that a little bit, I think Virginia did just pass a Voting Rights Act, I believe, in the last assembly. So you're saying that does not include that?
Not to my knowledge. I actually don't know, since I haven't gone to the polls since that law was adopted.
Right.
But I think Larry's right that the last time I went to vote, I was asked to produce my driver's license.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the details of what was in the Virginia Voting Rights Act, but I would certainly hope it would have included that, you know, given how recently it was passed.
So would I.
Okay, well, I don't want to monopolize everybody's, but so, please block me if I'm asking too many questions. But what happened, what happened in the mid 2000s that caused you said it was in the Bush administration, but what happened that changed the sort of focus of the Civil Rights Division, or that caused the Republican Party to change, if you know?
Well, what we found in the cases that I've been involved in is that Republicans saw a threat to their continued majority rule. Take, for example, the state of Georgia, which I know well because I've been involved in a lot of the Georgia cases. The demographics in Georgia were changing, with large numbers of Hispanic voters moving into the state to work in Georgia agriculture, in the carpet industry, in the poultry industry, and they were joining the African-American population as a predominantly Democratic group of voters once they became citizens. And they were becoming citizens at a higher rate than white folks in Georgia were comfortable with. And they saw the demographic changes. The same thing was true in Texas, which is now a majority minority state because of the growth of Hispanic voting strength there. They saw the handwriting on the wall that if they had two choices, they could go back to the more moderate positions of the Republican Party in earlier decades and try to compete for Hispanic votes in Texas and Georgia, along with African-American votes in those states. You may not recall, but when George W. Bush was governor of Texas, he succeeded in getting some Hispanic support because of his policies and because some of the positions he favored were actually favored by Hispanics who tended to be more conservative on some social issues than other citizens in Texas. And so they could try to recruit for the Republican Party more minority voters by adopting fairer public policies. The alternative, if they didn't want to do that, was to try and cut down on the minority voters who were able to participate in elections. And in most cases, they made that choice. That was the option they picked.
Well,
I don't want to sound partisan here. I'm describing what has actually happened to the parties, which troubles me as a Christian and as a citizen of the United States. And, you know, it's not because of mere party. It's because of the positions the two parties have taken on the issues of racial justice that I think we have to take seriously. And we have to act on what we've learned when we go to the polls and participate in elections.
but I have to say, given this reality, I mean, this is just my view, but it seems like a national law that would govern at least some sort of minimal access in elections would solve the problem. But I mean, this is not original to me, but it seems that given the choice that appears to have been made by the Republican Party, that getting a national law is going to be very difficult. So I mean, do you see any hope here? I mean, is there anything that can be done in, on a state level?
Well, Larry, I am pessimistic to a degree. I haven't been a long time on these issues. And I recognize that it would take an extraordinary change to gain sufficient Democratic strength in the Congress to overcome the difficulties that Senate rules place in the path of passing such legislation as you just described. Moreover, we have courts that have been stacked with much more conservative judges and justices at the Supreme Court level under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate for much of the last decade, and with the ardent support of the Federalist Society, which has come up with lists of extremely conservative young judges, young candidates to put on the bench, so that it's more difficult to win in court cases than it was in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And that's a part of the reality we have to deal with. But remember that even though the courts are stacked with conservative judges, over 60 cases brought by the Trump campaign and its supporters in the Republican Party failed miserably in 2020. And to the degree that they've still been in the courts in 2021, they have also failed. So it's not hopeless. And recall that I got started in voting rights when the Supreme Court had handed down a terrible decision for minority voting rights in 1980. And yet we managed to overcome that obstacle by getting the Congress to change the law. So I've seen things happen that made optimists out of pessimists. And as I recall, back in 1963, when I started on my journey that led to the voting rights cases, the Byrd machine was still running Virginia. The segregationists were running much of the South. And it took a major effort to overcome a filibuster in 1964 to pass the Civil Rights Act. And the only thing that prevented us from having to fight another filibuster in 1965 to pass the Voting Rights Act is the fact that several of the senior leaders of the segregationists in the Congress had fallen on ill health and were not able to mount a filibuster successfully. So, you know, I'm pessimistic, but I have to agree with Raphael Warnock, who, when asked the same sort of question, said he still had a lot of hope. And, you know, it's going to take a huge effort to overcome these changes. And one of my regrets is that I've seen evangelical Christians go far beyond simply ignoring the need for change to actively opposing change that would promote racial justice. And it pains me no end, and it makes it more challenging for Presbyterians who don't agree with that profound shift to the right on the part of evangelical Christians. It pains us to see Christians becoming a part of the problem, not the solution.
If I can ask a question, I was wondering if we're talking about what we're going to do and what the new groundwork is. So the photo ID thing is a big bugaboo because so many people don't have birth certificates. As I understand, is that correct, Peyton?
Yes.
Okay. So from a practical standpoint, how hard would it be to mount some sort of effort to help people in rural areas get birth certificates if there was a campaign to do that, not just to enroll people and get them registered, but actually help people get photo IDs as required? And that wouldn't that kind of stop the guns of, you know, not meeting the requirements? Is that something that's practical at all?
It seems to me it's very practical. It's similar to the way an organization in Georgia and Florida, I think, has tried to deal with the problem of felon disfranchisement. In many southern states, especially, people who have served, who were convicted of felonies and served their time in the penitentiary, who are out on parole and finish their period of parole or probation, are still unable to obtain the right to register to vote because of a requirement that they have repaid all of the court costs and fees and restitution requirements that the courts had placed on them. And there are organizations that are raising money to help people in that who are former felons to regain their right to vote, first by finding out exactly what the costs are that they have to meet, which in the state of Georgia, I think the state couldn't even tell you themselves. The state officials couldn't tell how much the person's owed. So they're trying to find out how much they owe and to raise money to provide financial assistance so that these former felons who are disfranchised can regain the right to vote. What you're proposing is a similar approach to help finance and organize a movement to obtain birth certificates for people who don't have them and need them to register to vote. But of course, it would also be possible to change the law to make it unnecessary to have those, and that's probably easier to do. But yes, we could mount such a practical challenge if we're in a state where the legislature will not do the job.
I have a question. Hasn't Florida already gone back to making it so that those people or organizations that were trying to raise the money to help people, I think Florida's just trying to institute a law such that they can't pay them?
I think you're right, Pamela. I think you're right. I don't recall exactly where that law is, but I do recall that's what the Florida legislature was trying to do. And remember that the voters in Florida adopted a constitutional amendment at the polls a few years ago that would have restored the right to vote for felons who've served their time. And the legislature stepped in and passed a law to make it necessary for them to repay all of the court costs and all of the fees that they owed. So the legislature has stepped in to prevent the voters from doing something to change this pattern. So, it's a struggle. And even the passage of a constitutional amendment by a majority of the voters in the state may not do the job if the legislature is intending to keep the practice of trying to suppress minority votes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peyton. I'm not sure you're a doctor or lawyer, but thank you. I will try to be brief, but I don't see very clearly what are your three main call to actions for everybody here. So me as a Latina and having been in Mexico for a long time, I learned in Mexico that the evangelicals are not a whole denomination. I thought they were like Catholics or like Lutherans or like PCUSA. And I'm starting to discern that there are a lot of little groups. So when we say evangelicals support the voting, restrictions, it's hard for me now to understand, is it like individual churches that decide, or is it a specific group? And what is our responsibility, or, like Christians' call to action to help these people of faith discern how there is such a big discrepancy between the faith they promulgate and the things that they're behind? Because my experience also in Mexico with the evangelical Christians is that it was a big herd of Latinos that were following the priest, and they don't necessarily know if their church is in favor or against rights that might benefit them or be against them. I hope I made my point clear. Thank you.
Very good question, Danielle. I painted with too broad a brush when I said evangelicals are now part of the problem. There are evangelicals and there are evangelicals. For example, you may be familiar with sojourners who are evangelicals who favor racial justice and social justice more broadly. There are great differences between Southern Baptists and the American Baptist Church, and between evangelicals in the Deep South and evangelicals in other parts of the country. But a majority of evangelicals have adopted a view that focuses on certain particular social issues, particularly on the abortion question, and also on the question of same-sex marriage or homosexual rights in general, and the rights of transgender persons. And if they have a focus on those issues, they are willing to go to great lengths to put very conservative judges on the courts. And that is what leads a lot of evangelicals to move far to the right, and to move to the right on all issues, not just on those particular social issues that motivate them. And that's a troubling trend. But that, I think, is what explains a lot of the shift of evangelicals to the right. But some of it is opposition to immigration, particularly immigration from Latin America, from Mexico and Central America and other parts of South America. So anti-immigration views and anti-voting rights, minority voting rights issues are associated in the minds of a lot of these evangelical Christians with the question of abortion, the question of same-sex marriage, the question of transgender rights. And so it's a more complicated picture than I had described in my remarks, because I was trying to focus on the question of voting rights.
Can I please just further on that question? Because now with the election, I was in Mexico trying to understand this thing in the South. And it's very hard for me to share that in my point of understanding was that a lot of the Latinos that were supporting the Republican Party and that support the restriction of voters and that are not in favor of increasing salaries are Latinos that are either Catholic or evangelical that don't want other Latinos that are from lower class to come. So a lot of them are entrepreneurs, or they had just to put it in short words, there is a racism that is hierarchical in Latin America, that is class oriented, that is been there for the colonial times, and that is now permeating in Texas, in Florida. So they don't want the Latinos that are lower class and they're more mestizos, they're not as white, to come up. And so the social mobility of the United States does not benefit them. So to put you a simple example, my cousin who now supported Trump said, I don't want Biden to win because then the price of my employees is gonna go higher and they're gonna want healthcare. And he's a Latino, he thinks of himself as Catholic, and I'm not trying to put him on the spot here. I'm just trying to explain you how this situation that exists in Mexico of racism, classism, it kind of translates to their decisions to support in Texas. And it was mind-blowing for me because at the end is hypocritical Christianism in my point of view. And I think that's the biggest challenge, to help them understand those two connections. In their heart, if they knew it, I don't think they will support it so bluntly. Thank you.
Well, I think you're right. Hispanics in Georgia, for example, to move to that state again from Texas, Hispanics in Georgia who were involved in business tended to be supporters of the Republican Party during the first 10 years of the 21st century. But when Governor Sonny Perdue came out with a speech which was frankly demagogic and was harshly anti-immigrant and was making claims about illegal immigrants coming in and immediately qualifying for welfare benefits and immediately managing to vote illegally because of the loose laws that justified some of the legislation that Republicans in Georgia wanted to adopt. The Republican Latinos in that state started to, whom he'd appointed to an advisory committee to advise the state government on issues affecting Latino businesses, all resigned in protest against what the governor had said. In other words, you're right that Latino businessmen might have a class interest that led them to oppose some immigration from Latin America. But when the opposition to immigration crosses the line into demagoguery, they may change their views. And there has been an increase in the percentage of Hispanics in this country who are voting Democratic in recent years as the Republican Party has shifted further to the right.
Thank you for whatever you're saying and explaining. I might come across as a little cynical, and I think I am, but is it more than, or is it different than Republican political strategy that is leading to all of this?
There is the strategic interests of the Republican Party that I have focused on, but of course, there's also an ideological component to it. It's hard to know how political leaders who usually understand how to get elected, how to get reelected, and who care a lot about getting elected and reelected, they understand how politics operates. And so it's a little hard for me to say that their ideological commitments are what's driving their actions, because their ideological commitments can can be what's involved. They could actually believe what they're saying, but they are usually smarter than that. They know that there's no massive voter fraud in this country. They're not stupid people. They run for office, they get elected, they understand how elections operate. And so, I tend to be cynical enough to think that it's more the political strategy than the ideology that's driving this. But, both could be working in tandem.
Again, thank you so much, Peyton. This has been really enlightening. We appreciate hearing the vast amount of experience you have and how that fits into what's going on today.